Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. I'm delighted to welcome Matt Evans, CEO and founder of Treeline Transformations, and we're going to discuss the roots of successful digital transformation. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Susie. Great to be here.
It's great to have you on the show. Matt, I know, and this is where we meet, that you're passionate about digital transformation, successful digital transformation, preferably,
Yeah.
and enabling businesses to adopt and adapt to the new ways of working, the new types of value creation. And I know you've spent a lot of your career doing this, particularly focusing on transformation from an IT and skills perspective, but clearly it's about so much more, and we'll come to those different areas. But it brings me back to the age-old trilogy of people, process, technology, which, never tires, does it? It's omnipresent. And that's where I'd like to start because I know customer focus is always imperative, as is expertise and scaling that, which we will come to later on in the discussion. But can we start with this idea of people, process, and technology, and how you see it playing out, Matt, in successful digital transformation initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. First and foremost, Susie, what I'd say is technology has taken off, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, not just in the last couple of years with
Mm,
AI, but over the last 20 years or even 30 years, it's been exponential growth in technology. And from my experience, the digital transformations that organizations need to focus on are bringing along people and process. People and process are lagging behind the technology advances that we've seen. And People often ask me, how do you define digital transformation? Because that's a term that's overly
yeah.
used.
Yeah.
Everyone has a different interpretation of it. And I tried to really simplify it and say digital transformation really is just working in new ways with new technology. And working in new ways, that is the
The
people
tricky bit.
process side. And then technology is the technology side, obviously. And so my focus is trying to get large organizations to shift how they work from a people and a process standpoint so that they can take advantage of the new technologies that continually come in, and that will continue to change our lives.
And I think the power that they have to enable the people and process part of it is huge, isn't it? But we sort of step into the, like you say, digital transformation is almost for me in the agile box. So everyone has their own definition, and people think it's all types of things, and there are no rights or wrongs in there, but it becomes a buzzword. So I love the fact that you've just simplified it down to exactly what we're talking about. But it's a huge shift, isn't it, in terms of people and process. But I think ways of working, but also the operating models and, organizations, particularly large ones, like to have quite complex, or should I say complicated, not complicated operating models. And it brings me to an area that you work a lot in, that resonates a lot with me as well, which is the COEs, the Center of Excellences. And I know there's a backstory to that from your time in Salesforce, and I would like to come to that. But before that, you define digital transformation, and thank you very much. What's your definition, Matt, of a center of excellence? Because for me, this is the heart of the discussion of how to scale things. So let's start with your definition, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, what a loaded question, Susie. What a
I
loaded question.
know.
Centers of Excellence or COEs have had many definitions. They mean a lot of things to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Centers of Excellence started in the mid 80s. In the manufacturing industry,
Mm,
and at that time they had factories that had different throughputs for the same widgets. And so
yeah.
let's imagine that you had a factory in London that was pushing out widgets at a certain in 3 weeks, let's say, and then you had one in the US that was doing it in 4 weeks. And so what the organization would try to do is they try to figure out how come it's a different throughput in these factories, even though it's the same widget. And so they'd go and visit the factory in London and say, what's working, what's not working,
Mm,
how are you pushing that through in 3 weeks? Then they go to the one in the US, let's say, and say, how do we get you from 4 weeks down to 3 weeks? And they called the group that did that, they called that a center of excellence. Now, much like a lot of manufacturing terms, like Kanban or Lean,
mm,
um, IT took those terms and applied them to technology. And so they started using this term center of excellence. But the problem is it was bastardized. It was
yeah.
hijacked. It
Mm,
was turned into anytime we have a meeting about anything, we're going to call it a center of excellence. And centers of excellence had all these different definitions.
mm,
And they started to have kind of this negative connotation because there wasn't a lot of value associated to it. And so
yeah.
when you talk about a center of excellence, how do I define a center of excellence? As I define a center of excellence is a value generating team in an organization that is making the organization better. And
Nice.
there's four types of centers of excellence that I focus on. I've narrowed it down to four types, and the more that you can narrow in on your type of COE, the better it is. And let me walk you through what those four
Yeah.
types are, Susie, and then we can dig in. But the first one is a build COE.
Hmm.
That's like the traditional factory COE
Yeah.
that they started in the 1980s. These are groups of people that are focused on helping the organization design, develop, deploy, and support applications. That they're
Mm.
building it, and they're measured on the ROI, the return on investment they get from purchasing that application. The second type of COE is a guide COE. These COEs are full of coaches that are driving continuous improvement efforts in the organization. Think of this as kind of agile coaching. Agile coaching
Mm.
would be considered a guide COE, but it doesn't just have to be agile. You can coach on process, on service, on agile, on DevOps, on
Mm.
architecture, whatever it is. And these guide COEs are focused on helping the organization get more value by gaining efficiencies. The third type of COE is a share COE. These share COEs are about facilitation between groups. And so, how do you facilitate best practices and learnings between groups? You're not pushing
Mm.
information to them; you're allowing them to share information between each other. And these share COEs are self-facilitated, and sometimes they're called like best practice
This,
centers,
yeah,
for
communities of
example.
practice or things like
Yes,
that. Yeah.
communities of practice, communities of competency.
Yeah.
And these shared COEs are all about gaining efficiency in the organization. Then the last type of COE that I've categorized is create COEs. These create COEs are experimenting with new ideas. Think of these as kind of like the innovation labs that you
Okay.
have. And these create COEs are looking for better customer experiences, better employee experiences by testing out new ideas. Now, most COEs that I've seen have are trying to be all of those things in one.
Just
And
going to
guess
say
what?
that.
They're not adding value to anybody because no one really knows how to use them or what their output is or what they're looking for. But organizations that can hone in and define the type of COE they are, they're going to be hyper focused on delivering the value of that COE,
Mm.
and they're going to be hyper successful.
And I love that because it forces the discussion and the intentional thought process around, do I want to build? Do I want to guide? Do I want to share? Do I want to create? Or do I need to do all of them? And if so, how does that articulate itself in my organization? Because you're right, the COE just gets shoehorned into existing processes, a little bit like we're doing agile and it's just a tiny bit different from waterfall, but they shove it into their own processes
Yep.
and in a way yes, they're doing agile, but the mindset isn't there. So what lies behind all your COEs for me is this understanding of the mindset that you need, not only to think about what center of excellence you need, but also what is that flow of value, which is by definition end to end in a digital transformation scenario. And it doesn't mean that just because I'm in manufacturing, I can't do something differently. Maybe today I need to share, but maybe in 6 months' time, we're going to need to build. So,
Yes.
and I think it's really interesting where it came from. But before we go to where it came from in your mind, I mean, and in your career and how you built it and then adapted it for clients in terms of impact, do you see a difference, Matt, between the European approach to COEs, setting up, implementing, and US approaches or Asian approaches? Are there differences across the globe?
But there are some differences. Those differences, they end up a lot of times in the same place, but the difference is how you begin. And let me give you an example. I was working with one client in Europe, and that client wanted the structured kind of step-by-step process for setting up a COE, and they wanted the COE certification. So when I worked
Mhm.
at Salesforce, I was asked to create a COE certification, and this client said, I want a COE certification in order to have the best COE and check all the boxes and go through the methodical steps of doing it. I didn't create that certification. I'll get to that in a second. um,
Excellent. Yeah, I want you to tell us
yeah,
why, but yeah,
yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah. But in the US, it kind of goes the opposite. It says it's kind of maverick. We need to get something
Mm,
done. Let's get a group of people together and we're going to call them a COE and we're just going to go. But there's no method behind it. It's a lot of times it's I've heard this term COE. I want to use that term COE because other people are using it, and so I have this group of people that are trying to do kind of some things for continuous improvement or trying to do things a little bit different in the organization. I'm going to call that a COE because it sounds like something different. And then we're
yes.
just going to go. And so it kind of takes on kind of this mind of its own. Now, in both cases, they have a hard time getting to success. In America, you can imagine why.
Yes.
And again, this isn't like all encompassing. Not every organization in
Of
America is this
course.
way, or every organization in
Yeah.
Europe, but these are just some of the trends. But in America, you can see why, because they don't really define their purpose up front. They don't define the value they're driving up front. And what happens is when you have somebody move companies, and they hear the term COE in one company, it means something totally
Something totally,
different
yeah.
in another company. Now in Europe, I didn't do that. I didn't do that certification, and this is why I was talking to the company that wanted that certification, and I said, "Why do you want that certification?" And they said, "Because we want to set up the best COE there is." And I said, "Let me ask you, are you ITIL certified?" And they said,
Hmm.
"Yes, we're ITIL certified." I said, "What about COBIT? Are you COBIT certified?" And they said, "Yes, we're COBIT certified." And I said, "And all your problems have gone away because of that?" And they said, "No, but we've
No.
checked all the boxes." And I said, "I could build the best COE certification and you could check all those boxes, but I
Yeah.
guarantee you you're going to be focusing on being COE certified. You're not going to be focusing on delivering the value that the COE is intended to deliver." So let's
Mm.
stop talking about the certification and let's start talking about value delivery, outcomes, problem statements, and let's get to the COE that way. And that's a fundamental shift in thinking, I think, that every
Totally.
organization needs to go through.
And it's a really different mindset, isn't it? Because it's not just a shift in thinking for that subject, is it? It's because, as we know, the human brain likes certainty and frameworks and things that it
Yeah,
can tangible grasp hold of that we feel safe with. And that's what certification gives us, as well as an indication of where we're doing and how safe things are. Um, but if I take that away, how do you see organizations trying to put in place and define their COE? Because if I look at your build, guide, share, create, I mean, you must have noticed my brain picked up on it straight away and went, oh, great. So you've got build,
mhm,
um, guide, share, create. Now then, which one do I need? And then I can put it in this box or that box. And
right,
that's what my brain did automatically because the simplification was nice for me. I then felt that I had a choice. But once
100%.
that choice is made, Matt, what are the challenges, the leadership challenges in thinking about, okay, my choice is made, tick a box. Matt's going to tell me how to put it in place, tick a box, and then what?
Yeah, great question. Great question. And because you do want to tick that box. And
Yeah.
and almost everybody I talk to when I talk about those four types of COEs, they say, "I want all four of those." And it's like, yeah,
Now.
I know you do now, right? But the question is which one do you want now? What's your intended purpose now? Let's start there. And then Susie, I was terrible at implementing COEs about 15 years ago. I did it terribly, and I did it all the time. I was the I built COEs at different organizations. Then I worked for
Mm,
Salesforce, and I helped their customers build COEs. And the reason I was terrible at it is because I took a very traditional lens at looking at it, and that traditional lens, I think, is what a lot of organizations
yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Is they say, "I want a COE. Okay, what am I going to do?" Well, number one, I'm going to create my COE charter or my
Yeah.
vision
Yeah.
statement. And then
Yeah.
once I have that vision statement, then I'm going to define the org chart. Who's going to be in that COE? And then I'm going to define the RACI document of who's going to do what in the COE. And then after that, I'm going to define my meeting cadence on what meetings I'm going to have. And then I'm going to have my first COE meeting. And every organization kind of starts their COEs that way. And
Mm.
every organization that I've seen start that way has one thing in common. They have one thing in common. And that one thing that they have in common is that they end up having more meetings, but
And
nothing
less
else
decisions.
really
Yeah.
gets done. Yeah, nothing else really gets done. And
Mm.
when I saw that, I felt terrible because I was pretty excited about helping organizations implement COEs, but then I saw the results of it and they'd shut them down. People would come to that first COE meeting excited, they'd nod
Mm,
their head, then they go back and do work like they always did it, and nothing really changed except they were going to more meetings. And so,
mm,
I worked with a team of design thinkers, and we reorganized the way that you design a COE using design thinking methods.
okay.
And what the thing was is that the first step wasn't to define the COE charter. It wasn't to
Yes.
define this vision statement. In fact, it wasn't even about the COE. The first step was to define who are you serving? Who's
Yes.
the internal customer of the COE?
Mm,
Who's getting value from this COE? Who are you providing the service to? And once you decide that internal customer, then it's very easy to say, okay, well, let's empathize with them and understand what their needs are. Now I know what the COE needs to provide.
mm.
And so instead of creating a COE charter, which is like internal focused about, hey, look at me, I'm a COE, we would create a value proposition, which would be for these
Nice.
internal
Mm,
customers who lack certain things in their jobs, the COE is going to provide this, and so it's all about them.
mm.
And once we had that, once we had the value proposition, then we could easily identify what services we're going to provide. We called them services, not capabilities, because they were in service of other people. And then we could drive those services within the organization. We left the org charting, we left the RACI documents, we left all of that to the end. And what happened
Mm,
was these COEs morphed into value generating organizations in the
mm.
COE. And so leadership, like it started to be it's simple when you have the step-by-step process, but when the step-by-step process is about how do you create a little more value and how do you create
Yes.
a little more value, and that's always top of mind, all of a sudden the COE is a living breathing organism that's driving value continuously, as opposed to taking time away from folks by attending meetings.
And I think those questions, Matt, that are so simple that we never take the time to ask, who's my customer? Very
Yeah.
simple question. Who's my internal customer? And people, it takes a long time to get there because the customer isn't top of mind, neither is the experience. And I think, excellence is a service, if I if I take what you're doing,
Yep.
based on this iteration sort of innovation methodology, brings with it not only a new model, but also a new challenge for me in terms of how do you, let's say we have a team doing that and they think like that and they do it well, how do we plug that back to the rest of the organization in a way that means that they can understand it? And I remember before the show we were talking about, this movement of which there are many approaches at the moment to move from project to product operating mode, particularly in the IT world. But for me, it's the same discussion. It's about the experience and it's about the value created. And you were saying that you don't call them product owners anymore, you call them experience owners. I love that. It really resonated with me. But I think now is a great time for us to explore what is an experience owner there for, and how does it link in, Matt, to the bigger picture of this sort of sustainable shift that we're trying to create in organizations?
Yeah, great. Oh, I love this. I love this topic, Susie. So yeah, just kind of to continue kind of transitioning from COE to this topic. Um, when organizations wanted to put in multiple COEs, build, share, guide, and create, once you have all four of those COEs in place, you're not talking about a center of excellence anymore. You're talking about a whole new way of operating, or a
Yes,
new operating model, or a
model.
digital
Yeah.
operating model, or adaptive operating model, whatever you want to call it. A lot of Forrester and Gartner and McKinsey all call them different things. But when you get to that operating model, then you got to figure out, okay, well, who's leading the charge here? And a lot of times that's when it starts rhyming with this shift from project to product ownership.
Yeah,
And
totally.
and
Mm.
I took the same mentality that I had with COEs. In fact, I was so successful doing these COEs at Salesforce, they gave me a new title, which was Director of Excellence. And I got to tell you, Susie, that was the best title I've ever had. When you could say, I'm the Director of Excellence.
I direct
um,
excellence around the organization.
exactly right. Exactly right. And we
Nice.
implemented 60 to 80 of these COEs hyper successfully in a short period of time. We started applying this to these larger operating models, and
Mm.
this project to product shift started to happen. And we took the same design thinking principles to say, well, hold on a second, what's the outcome of this project to product shift. And
Mm.
I really love the concept. I really love the idea of taking technology and not treating technology builds like projects, but treating them like products where they're
Yeah.
always iterating, they're always live. You're not in a plan, build, run state, but you're in
Mm.
always continually building state, and continually building and running. But I said the outcome really is to drive a better customer experience or a better employee experience, depending on the type of application. And so, what we started doing is shifting that move from to the outcome that they're trying to deliver. So instead of putting a product owner in place who's responsible for technology as a
Mm.
product, we'd say let's actually put an experience owner in place who owns the investment roadmap and the capability roadmap for a subset of customer experiences. And then that experience owner would also manage that team just like a product owner would,
Yeah.
but they would drive those experiences. So the experience owner isn't that much different than a product owner, but it is very different in so much as the experience owner is focusing on the experience, but also delivering like a product owner would.
Yeah, and if I take plan, build, run, what we're talking about now for me is build, measure, learn, in the sort of lean
Yeah,
startup,
love that.
and
Love that.
I really like, for me that would be the difference between what we're asking a project to do, plan, build, run, and what we're asking a product owner or experience owner to do, which is build, measure, learn in its entirety from one end of the experience to the other. How much resistance do you get to that, Matt? Because that's quite far out of people's comfort zones. Because my experience of helping people move from project to product, it's already quite a big leap.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, there is some resistance, but not as much as you might think,
Okay.
because it starts to make sense. In fact, when I talk to people about shifting from product to experience owner, this light bulb goes off because then they say things like, "Oh yeah, I always struggled with that term product owner because we don't have products. We do
Ah,
services or whatever."
okay.
And
Yes.
or I always struggle with that term product owner because we have products, and so we differentiate between our products and calling this a product. But when you shift that to experience owner, the light bulb goes off where they say, "Oh yeah, we're delivering customer and employee experiences. That's the outcome, and let's follow everything we've learned about product
Mm,
ownership. But let's put that term experience on the front of it, and let's start working towards delivering an experience." And a lot of times, what that does is that forces the organization to take a lot of their customer experience design out of a kind of boutique niche marketing theme and pull it throughout the organization. So they're
mm,
leveraging customer journeys throughout the organization and looking at it from an experience standpoint. And so that the shift is actually highly beneficial for most organizations I talk to
mm,
about it.
mm.
But it's still a struggle to get from project to experience. If they're
Yeah.
at product, the shift to experience is
Less.
pretty simple. Yeah.
But I mean, I've seen quite a lot of DX now with CX and UX, so the digital experience, and I think that lends itself to that. But I still have the same, well, I meet that challenge and I have the same question around that for you, Matt, which is often we get a customer journey map or a digital journey map on a wall,
Yeah.
with some actions that it's not happening, but it's still on a wall. What would your advice be on aligning strategy and execution in organizations? Because I think this is the gap that needs bridging in terms of operationalizing what we're talking about. And that doesn't mean that people are stupid and don't understand. It just means, how do I translate that? It's so far from what I'm doing today.
Yeah, yeah, because organizations put a lot of time, effort, energy, and funding into strategy,
Yeah.
defining the strategy, building the strategy, the OKRs, kind of
Mm,
whatever it is. And they spend an enormous amount of time in meetings, bringing experts in, saying, "What's our new strategy?" They spend a lot of time and effort and funding into execution, in building the teams, driving the teams, making sure the teams have the resources they need, the insourcing, the
yeah.
outsourcing, the tool sets they need. There's so much energy and effort into that. But where they don't spend any time, the biggest gap is what you're talking about, Susie, is how do you translate
Mm,
strategy to execution? And with between those two, there has to be what I call an operating committee. There
mm,
has to be a dedicated and functional a committee that defines the strategy and translates it to the tactics. And you know what? That operating committee isn't something that lives outside the strategy and execution. All it is pulling together strategy and execution. In other words, each execution team is going to have its experience owner, for example, and that experience owner is going to be kind of driving, hopefully using some sort of agile practices,
Mm,
driving continuous delivery and support of technologies. And each one of those experience owners is going to sit on an operating committee. And they're going to sit on an operating committee that includes design and architecture and experimentation. And that operating committee is responsible for defining the strategic into the tactical. In other
mm,
words, it acts as a buffer so that escalation doesn't have to go all the way to steering committee to the strategy piece, but it also acts as a definition arm to say, hey, this is what we mean. We need to make sure that we're looking at the big picture here while you're working on the small picture. And so implementing an operating committee in between kind of strategy and execution has been the golden ticket for helping organizations succeed. And people get it. They're like, oh
yeah.
yeah, we should be talking about this. How come we didn't think about this? How come we never put this in place?
It's too
But once
obvious.
they do, then yeah, then everything starts working out pretty well.
But I think it's just an example, isn't it? When I was semi-joking when I said it's too obvious that you get stuck in, you get used to the water you swim in. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way. So, and all decisions go through this, and a committee means that you have to have two or three signatures, and everyone has their own definition and sort of bias where it comes to that comes from where you've worked, what you think, how you've worked. So I think it's interesting to have these experience owners and actually maybe we're not putting the label on it, but they're role modeling, aren't they? Distributed
100%.
leadership and more empowered decision making, which I think is interesting because if you can bridge that gap, you can move from transactional back up into something more strategic and meaningful. And which brings me, Matt, to your tree,
Oh yeah.
or the tree line transformation, because for me, that gap there is something I see a lot in leadership. So, the transactional and the more strategic. But I love the fact that your logo is a tree,
Uh-huh.
and I know it's not random. So, can you tell us a little bit about tree line? Why a tree, and how does it fit into this very conversation?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I used an analogy when I was at Salesforce, and this is why my partner and I started Treeline, is based on this analogy because it resonated so well with folks. But what the tree's all about, and Susie, if we were together in a room, I'd have you do this. But anytime we're with executives, we invite them to draw a tree. Go up to
Okay.
the whiteboard and draw a tree, or draw a tree on a piece of paper. And I got to tell you, Susie, everyone draws trees in the same way. It's always a trunk with a little furry
The little
ball.
fluffy thing on the top, yeah.
Exactly,
And then I would
exactly.
follow it with that. I don't know how to draw. You know that, don't you?
Yes, exactly. Uh-huh, uh-huh. But you're better than you think you are,
Apparently
which is
so.
another.
Apparently so.
Yeah. And so they draw these trees, and then we talk about it, and we look at it and we say, okay, what's missing from your drawing? And usually they say, oh, well, I didn't draw the branches. And we say, well, no, 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 that furry ball represents leaves and branches. We get it. And they say, well, I didn't draw the grass. And we'd say, well, no, we didn't ask you to draw the grass. We just asked
Mm,
you to draw a tree. But everybody, when they draw trees, they miss one fundamental aspect of a holistic tree, and that's the roots. No
mm,
one ever draws the roots when
no.
they draw a tree. But are the roots important to a tree?
Otherwise it's
Of
going to
course
fall
they are.
over.
Exactly. They keep it from falling over when the wind
Mm,
blows. In other words, they give it stability. They give it nutrients. That's how the tree feeds and grows.
mm,
But if the roots are so critical to a tree, why don't people draw them?
yeah.
And what people say is, well, out of sight, out of mind. You don't see them, so you don't draw them. And that's where we bring the analogy home, where we say, yeah, most organizations approach their transformations the same way they approach drawing a tree.
Yeah.
They only focus on what they can see.
Yeah.
And usually in a transformation, what you can see are things like your strategy. So you have this new Venn diagram and says, we're going to focus on what's in the middle, and we're going to make plaques with our strategy and paste them around. Or,
Mm,
or, or oftentimes your systems. We're going to buy
yeah.
this new tool or technology or this new AI. And if we put
Mm,
this in place, we're going to transform. Or this process, we're going to
mm,
implement agile. And if we follow this process flow that we can see, then we're going to change. Or a new org chart.
mm,
If we put a new org chart with boxes and dotted lines in between, then we're going to transform. And a lot of times they try those things they can see because they're tangible. You could touch, you could feel them, you feel comfortable with them,
Mm,
but they don't focus on the roots. And in this analogy, what the roots represent is the roots represent the cultural, the
mm,
intangible, the human aspects of the transformation.
mm.
They represent the unwritten rules about how work actually gets done at
Gets
this
done. Yeah.
organization,
Yeah.
the assumptions people make about what it means to be successful here and be promoted, the values individuals have, and
Mm,
how those align to the corporate values of the company, and ultimately the behaviors on how
mm.
people interact with each other are the roots, the things you don't see, and they're harder, they're squishy. You have a hard time kind of thinking about them. But I got to tell you, Susie, we sit in meetings with these executives and we say, who's responsible for the strategy of this transformation? And somebody raises their hand, and we say, who's responsible for the architecture and the systems? And somebody raises their hand. And who's responsible for the culture and the individual behaviors between people during this transformation? And that's when people furrow their brow, they look
Mm.
around the room,
Yeah.
somebody says, oh, I think culture is an HR thing.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and so
Nobody
our
owns up to
whole
individual behaviors.
Exactly, exactly. And so
Mm,
our whole idea and concept with Treeline and why we've been so successful is because we believe that in order to transform successfully, you need to take an intentional and deliberate approach above ground with the things you can see, as well as below ground with the things you can't
mm,
see to drive transformation. And so every time we work with any organization, we always say, what's our plan? What's our above ground strategies? What's our below ground strategies? How
mm,
are we going to implement a new strategy, process, system, org structure, but also how are we going to weed out behavior failure modes that are slowing us down? How are we going to put in new cultural characteristics? How are we going to make sure we understand the values and
mm,
the unwritten rules? And how are we going to embrace that to make those better? And that's been the key. That's been the differentiator for us, I would say, is once you start getting to how people behave, it starts
mm.
working because you can have the best strategy, structure,
Of
system,
course.
process, but
Mm.
then people mess it up because we're
Yep.
human beings and
Of
we don't like
course.
change. And
No.
so taking that deliberate approach, that's why we call ourselves tree line, is that line between above ground and below ground and how we drive that forward. And if you notice in our logo, we have a little hand coming out of the ground, a
Yes.
human
I
hand,
saw that.
trying to bring that humanistic kind of behavioral idea to the light so you can start to see that.
And I love that analogy because I think, humans are perfect imperfections, aren't we? And that's the messy bit, isn't it? That the messy bit is always the human bit, and it's darker, it's harder, it's not as visible until it fails. But, looking below the waterline, it's so easy to be transactional because let's be clear, that's really what we get paid to do in organ is deliver
Yep.
tangible deliverables. And when I look at it, I'm thinking, wow, if I put that onto leadership, that's what we do. We show our expertise, we manage teams, we look at how things are done, we collaborate together on processes, on technology. But it's quite hard to get down to where we're not used to going. So the sort of more creative side of our brains, the more emotional side of our brains that everybody has, but everybody has learned not to mention. And I'm really thrilled to see a big shift in that. And I think part of it's generational, but part of it is, this challenge we all have to constantly question ourselves, learn and learn and relearn, which is massively pushed by digital, of course, COVID being a massive example of. But how do you see leaders managing? I would like to see a whole team of hands coming up, from the bottom to hold the top of the tree. The top of the tree being
Uh-huh.
the easiest to see, and to be fair, the easiest to climb. But
Yes.
yeah, but if you make it top heavy and the roots aren't strong enough, of course, it will fall over. So what do you see organizations do to equip their more senior leaders, Matt? Because that's where the challenge is for me. And that's a blanket statement, but there is a trend there. So clearly, not every senior leader, but there is a trend there that the senior leaders are more stuck in the transactional binary doing of organizations, including strategy, than the sort of what's often seen as fluffy, like you say, that nobody really wants to navigate on their own type of thing. So how do you see organizations managing that?
Yeah, yeah, good question. So different leaders need different characteristics, and what I see is probably one of the highest characteristics that leaders need in order to be successful in this area is curiosity.
Yeah.
Curiosity breeds empathy. And when you have curiosity and you look for curious people, then you're able to kind of weed that out
Mm.
and really understand what the roots are. You saw what I did there. And
Yeah.
so and so the and when I say curiosity, this is what I mean. You need to be able to understand what you're looking at, and that's one way that we help leaders do that. If we're kind of going in and working on the below ground, the cultural elements,
Yeah.
what we try to do is we just try to expose what are some of the things that are happening in this organization, and we try to expose that by actually gathering stories of failures that have happened culturally in the
Mm.
organization. And we bring leaders together and we say, let's take some time and read these stories and identify themes. We just did this about 2 months ago with a company I won't mention because we're talking about
Of
culture
course.
failure modes,
Of course.
but it's a company that everybody in the world knows.
Okay.
And we did this. We had about 13 of their IT leaders together, and we had collected about 60 stories from their large IT department that really emphasized some ways that trust broke down,
Mm.
or that commitments weren't followed through on,
Mm.
or people felt like they took a risk, but they got their hand slapped after they
Yeah.
took the risk, even though they're invited to take risks. And
Yes.
we read through these stories and had leaders read through these stories. And when they read these stories, there's this gap. There's
Mm.
this depth that exists between how leaders think the culture is and how the culture actually is, because
Totally.
people in lower positions don't feel like they can speak up openly or don't feel like they're heard. And so leaders think, oh yeah, we have a very good culture. We have a trusting culture. We're psychologically safe. But when you go to the actual employees and you pull out stories from them, you start to see that that's not the case. And so what we try to do is expose these curious leaders to these stories where they
Mm.
read them, they take them in and they understand them and they identify themes. And this organization we worked with, they identified some themes that were pretty hard for them to take on. One of the themes they identified was something that they termed planado, which is a tornado of planning, where
Right.
planning just always is
Takes
swirling and
over.
nobody really
Yeah.
knows what the priority is, and priorities change every week. But at the strategic level, they think these are our priorities. But when it gets down to it, people don't, and so they sit it out, or they say,
Mm.
I'm going to wait for the strategy to change again, so I'll go a little slower on this piece. But once we identify that that's an issue, and we do that with real stories, and so it's
Mm.
not something that's made up. They've read it. They've read these experiences. They're anonymous, but they
Yeah.
know that they're happening. Then we can say, how do we counter that? What are some behaviors we can put in place to counter that's coming up? And so we found all types of cultural failure modes, everything from something called My Kingdom, where I'm only focused on my team,
Mm.
to phone a friend, which is I skirt process to go find somebody who can get something done for me.
Mm.
And once we find these cultural failure modes, then we're able to identify those, bring those to light. And once you give something light, these senior executives, they're so good at
Yeah.
taking and attacking
Yeah.
those and putting behaviors in place that are going to
Mm.
counterbalance those.
Mm.
And what it elicits, Susie, from these leaders is an emotional response.
Yes.
We've had leaders tell us this touches me emotionally. I had no idea this
Mm.
was happening in my company.
Mm.
Thank you for exposing this. And with that curiosity and open-mindedness, they're now able to go and counterbalance that. And
Mm.
so that's the training that we put leaders through. They've already been trained on a lot of the how-tos and leadership training and leadership characteristics. What we try to do is we try to expose them to real life situations and then train them as leaders and coach them on how they can actually put behaviors in
Mm.
place. They're going to counteract some of those failure modes that we find.
I think that's so interesting. And I think, I work a lot in inclusion, and for me, you need conscious inclusion for any type of innovation. But this whole idea of lived experience, for me, if I take your analogy, lived experience is the fertilizer for those roots, isn't it? Because
Oh, love
when
that.
you feed that back into the ground below the tree line, let's take the analogy, that is what's strengthening and also making new fruit appear. As you say, I never realized that. I never realized I could express it to. I never realized it was happening. And I think the whole lived experience piece is bringing something innately human that at the roots of us as human beings, that's the roots of our identities and its
Yes.
storytelling. Um, and I know time is running, but I can't let you go off the podcast episode without this question of, if I take that innate human Lego brick of how we build digital transformation, Matt, what do you see happening with generative AI? Because for the moment, and I'm crossing my fingers, generative AI can't do that. It can't create, it can create a recital of these lived experiences. It can't create that emotional reaction, can it?
It cannot, because that's a human characteristic.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
human characteristic. And so generative AI, I'm so excited and thrilled with
Mm,
where we are today and where we're going. I'm excited about generative AI. I'm excited about the changes that we've seen happen over the last couple of years and what we're
yeah.
seeing going on. And from my perspective, and it's not all inclusive, but from my perspective, most organizations are still trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
In other words, we know we have this tool. We know we have this new power kind of in our hands, and we know some use cases for it, but we don't know how to actually make it happen, how we envision it could happen. No one's
Mm,
figured that out yet. In other words, everyone's taking generative AI and saying, "Yeah, we're going to increase productivity by a couple of hours." Per week per employee, and that's our goal, which is a
mm,
good goal,
mm,
and which is probably, Susie, how you use AI, how I use
mm.
AI. It's going in and writing things better. It's going in and looking at. I mean, I assume you're going to take this podcast and put it in AI and say, what themes do you pull out
What
of
do
the
you think of it?
transcript? Yeah,
Yeah.
what do you think of it? What should I talk about? And it's fantastic for that as kind of a workflow.
Mm,
And organizations are pouring millions of dollars and resources into figuring this out, but we
mm.
still haven't cracked that nut. And I think it's because what you talked about, Susie, it doesn't have that human aspect to it. And
No.
so I think generative AI is going to excel at the process and technology piece, going back to our
Yes,
first of our
yes,
conversation. And
yes.
I think it's always going to lack on the people side. In other words, there's always going to
Yeah.
be a human being at the forefront of driving the strategy, driving the operations, driving the execution, doing that in above ground and a below ground way.
Yeah.
And generative AI is going to be a supporting function
Mm,
for that from a process and technology standpoint. Because, like you said, generative AI can't feel, it can't dive in and pull out. Now, that being said, there's going to be huge advances
yeah.
in bringing those two things closer and closer and closer together. But we can't wait for technology to become human. We have to be humans and leverage the technology ourselves, because
Mm,
technology is never going to become human, and we need to embrace those things about us, and a lot of those things, the below ground things,
mm.
those cultural, intangible things about pulling people along, overcoming that fear of AI,
Yeah.
overcoming the challenges of that AI brings kind of into the workplace
Mm,
and driving that forward. I see
mm.
AI as creating more jobs, not taking jobs away.
Yeah.
But again, having that curious mindset to say, what is this going to do for me, is going to be kind of the leadership characteristic that drives that forward.
So we all need to buy a spade and dig a little bit deeper. Matt, on that note, if you had one last call to action or recommendation for our listeners, what would it be?
Yeah, so that call to action, what I would say, and this is something you could do individually, or this is something you can do organizationally, but that call to action is to shift your thinking from activity based to outcome based. And that's been a theme from our whole conversation
Yeah.
from the start when we talked about COEs. It's shifting it from the activity of starting a COE and having meetings to the outcome of who's our internal customer, how are we serving. When we talked about project to product, it's shifting that mentality from the activity of treating a technology like a product to the outcome, which is what experience are we driving with our employees or with our customers. And when we talk about the tree, it's what's the outcome is getting humans to work better together so that we can be more customer focused and deliver technology faster. So shifting to that outcome, you can do that individually by just saying, okay, hold on, let me step back for a second. What am I trying to accomplish with this project, with this meeting, with this sprint, with this executive strategy session?
Mm,
What's the outcome, and who is that outcome for? You could do that systematically by saying, hey, on my new idea intake form, I'm going to add in another field that says, how is this going to impact the customer experience, or what
mm,
outcome am I trying to drive with this? Or you can do that organizationally by saying, we're actually going to shift from project to product ownership to experience ownership and look at those outcomes, or
nice.
we're going to shift our COEs from thinking about kind of process to the outcome that we're trying to drive. And so if there's one call to action, I'd say it's have that outcome mentality today in your job and think about how you can do that organizationally. Susie, I'm going to put a little plug in here. I built a COE online course that you could go and purchase, and it walks you through the steps for
Okay.
starting one of those four types of COEs. And that's outcomes based. It's actually takes you step by step from thinking about process to thinking about the outcome of where we're going. That could be a call to action. If you want to jumpstart that with some more ideas or content, then that's one way that you can easily and tangibly click a button and say, I'm going to go do that. So those are that'd be my call to action is let's focus more on outcomes than process or than operations.
Okay, super. Thank you. So focus on outcomes. I'm going to leave our listeners with that. Focus on outcomes and own the experience, be it individual or collective. I will also put in the show notes the link to that course, Matt, so that people can find it easily. And while we're on that subject, where can they find you and more about what you do and who Treeline are and things like that?
Yeah. So again, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. Treelinetransformation.com is our website, where you'll find kind of who we are and what we do. And but feel free to reach out. Matt at treelinetransformation.com is my email. I'm happy to jump on a call with you, have a conversation with you. As you could tell, I'm a little bit passionate about these topics,
Yeah.
and would love to continue the conversation, learn from you, hear what's working, what's not working. I'm the first to say that I don't have all the answers to a lot of these complicated questions, but I have a lot of experience working through the answers. And every organization's different. A lot of times consultants say, "Oh, people think they're different, but they're actually all the same." I have a different opinion.
Yes. Yeah.
Everybody is actually different.
Yes.
And so bringing expertise from other organizations and matching it with how your organization's different, that's where the magic's found. But feel free to reach out. Would love to have those conversations because I want to keep learning. Susie, I've learned from you. And I think I told you
Likewise.
in our prep call, yeah,
Yeah.
I want to talk more just to download everything that you have to offer because there's so much there.
We can create our own little share COE. And so if you want to be part of that, drop us a line. Okay,
Sounds
super.
great.
Matt, thank you so much for coming and sharing what you've done, your insights, your stories, your expertise. Thanks. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, Susie. Great to talk to you.
Likewise.